Hello and welcome to Volt UK's first ever panel discussion that's been live streamed. During the coronavirus, of course, we've all had to adapt. And this is also our first public event on federalism within the UK. I'd like to particularly thank our guests for joining us today. We have Cesar Vera from Spain. He is the Vice President of the Volt chapter there. We have Kodrin Timu, who is a research assistant and doctoral candidate in law at the University of Constance in Germany. And finally, we have Brendan Donnelly, the current director of the Federal Trust and former MEP from 1994 to 1999. The event will be chaired by me, Alex Gunter from Volt UK. We'll hear some information and some speeches by the panelists, and then we will head into some questions and answers. This event is being streamed on both Facebook and YouTube. And if you'd like to ask a question, just type into the chat boxes, which are available in YouTube and Facebook, and we'll pick up the questions and we will do our best to squeeze as many of them in as possible. Feel free to ask a question at any time, however, we will keep the questions towards the end. So to start off with, I'll just give a little bit of context. On the 4th of April, Keir Starmer assumed office as leadership of the Labour Party and leadership of the opposition. For the first time ever, we had a leader of the opposition who's actually used the word federalism. Prior to this, we had many politicians discuss that regional devolution and other methods of local autonomy. However, this is the first time we've had a politician in a long time to actually use the word federalism. This is a massive improvement on the false promises of local autonomy that have been come from before. The Labour Party, though, is not a state when it comes to devolution. We've had the developments of the local administrations in Scotland and in Wales. However, the local governance in the UK is not as effective as it could be. This is changing. We've clearly seen now that federal states have dealt with the coronavirus much more effectively than unitary states. Germany, a federal state, has a mortality rate of around 9–10%. Australia, less than 1%. Yet UK, for example, has a 54% mortality, mortality rate. Spain and Italy with similar numbers. Even in the USA, which is federal, which has struggled comparatively to other European federal systems, has a mortality rate of about 28. Scottish independence, of course, has been the biggest driver for federalism in the UK. It's caused much of the political anger, and many unionists particularly have claimed that federalism is the answer to stopping Scottish independence. One of the major obstacles, of course, being to federalism in the UK is the confusing electoral system, which has manipulated election results for many years now, and we've seen a strong government not really caring much for the Scottish situation. Regardless of this, federalism is not necessarily the answer to solving Scotland's issue with the rest of the country. The same goes with issues in Wales, and of course now we're also seeing regionalism grow in many of the regions within England itself. The Yorkshire Party in Cornwall and the MK in Cornwall are growing significantly, especially since Brexit. First of all, I'd like to introduce Brendan Donnelly. He's the director of the Federal Trust and former MEP, and has also been involved in many campaigns since then relating to federalism and Brexit. Brendan, I'd like to pass over to you.
And I think you can hear me now. Can you hear me now? Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I think it's worth beginning with a descriptive definition of federalism. That's particularly important in the context of the United Kingdom. But I know among my own acquaintances that those who regard themselves as federalists often don't regard me as a federalist because I'm insufficiently zealous in pursuing federal solutions, whereas those who don't regard themselves as federalists are convinced that I'm an obsessive federalist. And I can see the point of both of those positions. It goes back to the definition that I remember looking up in the Chambers dictionary a few years ago of federalism, which gave two meanings. One, a political philosophy of centralization. Two, a political philosophy of decentralization. which didn't get me much further forward or anybody else who was reading the dictionary. But both of those definitions, of course, are half-truths, they're half-right. I define federalism as a codified, and it's important to stress codified, distribution of powers between various levels of government, where those levels of government are significant in number and significant in powers, and enjoy, and this I think is the crucial point, a political legitimacy of their own. And when you come to consider such a definition, I think it's easy to understand why federalism is quite difficult to fit into the British context, with the doctrine, the legend, the myth, some people would say, but the very powerful myth of parliamentary sovereignty. It's very difficult to have another level of government which is as legitimate or regarded as being as legitimate as that of the Westminster Parliament. I think that's changing, and I think that if I may, I'll spend most of my time talking about the future of federalism in various parts of the United Kingdom, in the United Kingdom itself, and then I'll say something about the European Union. I think that for the reasons that that Alex mentioned, the pandemic and the way the pandemic has been dealt with has made quite a lot of people think about whether a much more devolved and decentralized structure for England wouldn't be a better way of going about confronting national calamities and national crises. And I think also Brexit is going to make more people think about the regional aspects of its impact. London, for instance, is going to be disproportionately badly affected by Brexit, as indeed are the traditional manufacturing areas of the United Kingdom. It may well be that there will be pressure, that there will be movements towards a much more decentralized way of governing England in the coming months and years. I also would echo what Alex was saying about Keir Starmer. I would analyze the situation perhaps slightly differently. I think that he has not said a great deal about federalism recently, and I suspect that he has a very opportunistic view of these issues. But it may well be that what he will want to do over the next 3 or 4 years is build up an anti-conservative coalition, of which he would be a much more plausible leader than his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. And one element of that may well be to bring the traditional Liberal Democrats on board by a constitutional agenda, even by a commitment to proportional representation. So I can well see that within England, and I stress I'm talking at the moment about England, I'm not necessarily talking about the United Kingdom, there may well be political pressure for more federalism over the coming years. I think that is also going to happen in Northern Ireland, because I was talking the other day to somebody who was very much involved in the Good Friday Agreement, and he thought that Brexit had shifted the possibilities of a united Ireland very decisively over the past few years. He personally would have been in favour of Mrs. May's proposal to have a single customs area for the whole of Great Britain and Ireland, including Northern Ireland. He thought that the barrier, the frontier in effect, running down the Irish Sea will be an important factor pointing towards a united Ireland in the foreseeable future. Now, if that is so, then it would obviously be a federal Ireland that you would envisage. Ulster would be one of the elements of this federation, and there are a lot of people who say that in the Republic of Ireland, Dublin is much too predominant, much too powerful, and there will be a lot of support, I think, if it were in the context of a united Ireland, to have a federal Ireland rather than the centralised state that you have at the moment in the Republic. Wales, I think, is a case in which most people who are interested in federalism are interested in UK federalism. The Welsh independence movement is not nearly as strong as the Scottish independence movement. And I think that many people who favour more devolution, a more decentralised United Kingdom, would be content for Wales to be one element in this more decentralised United Kingdom. Scotland, I think, however, is a very different situation indeed. I think there were many people who thought 15, 20 years ago, I might well have been one of them, that a federal United Kingdom would be a way of making it easier to guarantee or at least facilitate the maintenance of the United Kingdom. I'm not sure I believe that any longer. I think that the argument and the politics have moved on in such a way that it's inevitable that in the next 2 or 3 years we will have a new referendum on Scotland, which may well be a referendum leading to independence. And I certainly don't think that it will be possible to bring about a federal United Kingdom in the timescale that will make any difference to Scottish aspirations for independence. Now, it may be that when we have this referendum, the Scots will decide not to go for independence. Nobody can guarantee or foretell that. But I think there's quite a good chance that they will. And as I say, I don't think that now we have the time to institute a federal United Kingdom, even if it were possible politically, which I think is very difficult at the moment, until we get another government. I think it will be too late to influence the outcome of the referendum that I see as being inevitable. So I see a Scottish referendum and an Irish referendum in the foreseeable future, one of which will lead to probably a federal Ireland, the other of which will lead probably to an independent Scotland. And it will be a very interesting debate to have in Scotland, whether their structures should be federal or not. But that's something that I think has to take place after the referendum. Briefly, I'll conclude on Europe, if I may, because others will be talking more about that than I can. It sometimes used to be said in the United Kingdom by people who wanted to maintain British membership of the European Union, that they were in favour of British membership of the European Union, but they were against federalism. That always seemed to me an incoherent position, because the European Union is, of its nature, a federalist structure. That's not a fully federated federation, perhaps it will never be so. But its tendency is towards ever greater union, ever greater federalism. You can be in favour of that or you can be against it. But the United Kingdom found itself in the strange position of being in an ever closer union and yet claiming that it didn't want to be part of this ever closer union. Even the people who said they were in favour of remaining in the European Union often supplemented that commitment by saying, but of course I'm not a federalist. I think that when we rejoin the European Union, and I'm quite sure we will rejoin the European Union, it won't be possible to get away with that equivocation. By that stage, the federalisation of the European Union will have proceeded very much further even than it is today. The setting up of the single currency was an enormously important step in a federalizing direction. But then steps towards the progress, as I would regard it, towards a federal Europe marked time. It became an impasse. It became a cul-de-sac for 15 years because there were so many debates about the precise form of the governance of the Eurozone. I think COVID-19 has given an impulse to resolving these questions and resolving them in a way that I welcome and which will be a federal way. It may be that the expansion of the European budget is the bridge over which the European Union goes, a bit more than the mutualization of debt in the short term. But I think that all these developments are going in the same direction, and the European Union will, in 10 years' time, be more just like it is now, only more so. It will be a more federal European Union because some of the implications of the Eurozone will have been drawn out. Well, I've covered a lot of ground, and I think that anybody who agrees with everything I say hasn't been paying attention, because there must be something that people disagree with. But those are my views, and if you don't like them, I'll consider changing them. I'm not prepared to be overruled, but I'm prepared to be convinced of the contrary. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Brendan, very, very much for that. One thing I would like to pick up on straight away, actually, is you talk a lot about how regionalism within the England itself, and I mean England here, is likely to show its head quite significantly. Obviously, in London itself is a powerful city-state and would probably be one of the richest countries in the world should it be independent, is very, very different and has a lot of reasons to be very upset with funding the rest of the country. Similarly, in the more manufacturing areas of the UK, they're going to suffer heavily with Brexit. But Brexit itself has created such a huge amount of British nationalism within people and English nationalism as well, to the extent that a recent poll said that around 50% of hard leavers within England are actually pro-English independence. Do you think that there is enough political will to ever break up England into regions for some form of regional government?
Well, I think the political future of the United Kingdom is very, very uncertain and very, very volatile. You corrected yourself when you said British nationalism was generated by Brexit. I don't think that British nationalism is being generated by Brexit. I think English nationalism is being generated by Brexit. And the question is, as the implications of Brexit become clear, how robust will that English nationalism be? And I doubt its robustness, because until now we have had none of the, or very few, of the negative perceivable consequences of Brexit. That's all going to come in a rush in the next 6 months, and particularly at the beginning of next year if we have. So I think all I can say is that the case for a federal England will be much stronger, and there will be people arguing towards it over the coming months. What will be the broader political context in which that debate takes place, I don't think anyone can say at the moment.
Absolutely. Currently, we obviously have no real vision of what's going to happen in the UK. Thank you very much, Brendan, for that. And we'll come to some questions later on from people. We've already got a couple of questions rolling in. So I'd like to move on now. Now, obviously, federalism is not a uniquely British concept, and many European states have been embracing aspects of federalism for many, many years now. The German and Swiss federalism is probably one of the more famous types of federalism in use in Europe. The Swiss Confederation being, although being a federation, is one of the oldest in Europe. But it's not all simple, and we have some states in Europe which operate some very regional and devolved systems which are actually federal. So today we have Cesar Ferrer, who is from the Spanish chapter of Volt. He is the vice president, and today will talk a little bit about Spain's federalism without federalism. Please go ahead.
Yo, hello. Could you hear me properly? Yeah. Okay, that's great. So first of all, thanks for inviting me. I will use these 10 minutes to talk about the Spanish political administrative organization, how it looks like, and how our organization differs a bit from what is generally called as federalism. So first of all, Spain is not a federation. It looks like from the outside. It's, so to say, a federation without federalism, as you correct said. And first of all, I want to explain you how the system in Spain looks like. No? In Spain, there are autonomous communities, comunidades autónomas, which are a first level of political and administrative division. This was created in accordance with the Spanish Constitution of 1978, with the aim of guaranteeing limited autonomy of the nationalities and regions that make up Spain. Each community has its own set of developed powers. Typically, those communities with a stronger local nationalism have more powers, and this type of devolution has been called asymmetrical. There are 17 autonomous communities and 2 autonomous cities that are collectively known as autonomies. And this unique framework of territorial administration is known as the state of autonomies. It is often said that Spain is a federation or a quasi-federal country. But while Spain shares some federal features, many core elements are absent in the Spanish case. The Spanish model of territorial administration is a system which shares some elements with federalism, like the autonomous communities have parliaments with legislative powers, as well as their own governments, and they possess a series of competences, particularly with regard to social policy, such in the areas of health, education, culture, environment. But Spain is not a fully federal model for the following reasons. The current Spanish Constitution from 1978, this year is very important to remember, 1978, because, you know, after the Spanish Civil War, after Franco, then is when democracy came to Spain, you know, with this Constitution from 1978, and when Franco died, I mean. And the Constitution established the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation, and the Spanish people as subject of the national sovereignty. And some of the autonomous communities did not even exist as administrative regions before that date, before 1978. The division of powers is also very important. The decentralization of legislative powers in Spain is quite unclear. The central power maintains its hegemony through the basic and constitutional laws, which are the same throughout the state and which can be developed in a centralized way in many areas. That the statutes of the community, so the constitutions of the communities have to be approved by the general courts before being subject to referendum in the corresponding communities. What else can we say? The judicial power, unlike the legislative and executive powers, the Estado de las Autonomías has had practically no effect on the structure of the judiciary, which continues to be that of a centralized state. Senate is also very important. The upper chamber is not linked to the federated units. The majority of the senators are elected by the provinces, a set of administrative divisions which date back to the 19th century, and the autonomous communities play no practical role in the legislative power of the federation. In the second legislative chamber, the Senate does not directly represent the communities. So this differs quite a lot from a federal system. Also, taxation is important, no? In our system is long way from any model of fiscal federalism. The most important taxes are collected by the central power, which later returns an amount equivalent to that which the autonomous communities need, no? Which is a permanent controversial quantification in order to finance the powers that they have. The Basque Country and Navarra are the exceptions to this rule, as they enjoy an asymmetrical fiscal agreement with the central power, which is based on a number of historical rights which come from the 1978 Constitution, and which are regulated under terms which are even more confederal than federal. On the other hand, this is the most asymmetrical legal characteristic of the Spanish political system. Regarding the European Union, the autonomous communities within Spain are not considered to be political actors in relation to the principal institution of the European Union, in contrast to the Federation of the European Union, particularly Belgium and Germany. The central government has resisted giving any important role for the communities in relation to European issues. Let's talk about the constitutional reform. The communities do not participate in the process of constitutional reform. No? This is in the hands of the central parliament and of the citizens of the state through referenda. So to resume, the general conclusion is that the current Spanish Estado de las Autonomías does not have important elements in either institutional or procedural that usually define federations. In fact, the Spanish Constitution included more potential asymmetrical elements than genuine federal elements. Although the Spanish state of autonomy shows an intermediate level of decentralization, it also shows a rather low level of constitutional federalism. However, it is a decentralized state when compared with other regional states, and it has one important thing in common with federation, which is that decentralization is designed for all the territorial subunits and not only for some of them. Notwithstanding some works of comparative politics in which the Spanish state sometimes appears classified in a not so very accurate methodological way within the federal states, there are many arguments that would suggest that perhaps it would be more appropriately situated in the group of regional states. So in my opinion, the federal solution continues to be a reasonable and a valid option to resolve the territorial conflicts in Spain, but not just any federalism will do. No solution, I think, will emerge until constitutional reforms are made that will, amongst other things, recognize the plurinational and plurilinguistic character of the state. Spain is not one nation with divergent traits, but rather a plurinational state. It's a plurinational state, or if you will, a nation of nations. So it is necessary to recognize the right of the different elements which make up the state to decide their own future, for example, through a basic democratic guarantee of a new agreement within the state. So it's a federal model possible in Spain. It is true that in Spain, the statutes of autonomy are organic laws approved by the general courts and not the Cortes Generales, and not constitutions drafted and approved by the regions, as is typical of a federal system. But the establishment in our country of this model will not have to entail any major change. Spain is already structured as a federation of autonomous territories united in the same nation, so that the change of system could be useless. An asymmetric federal monarchy like Canada, where Queen Elizabeth II and her 10 provinces have more powers than her 3 territories, does not differ much from the different Spanish autonomous state, not from the heterogeneous Spanish autonomous state. So for Spain to be an authentic federal state, it will have to enjoy a Senate that would fulfill the role of a true territorial chamber. Currently, only a fifth of the members of the upper house, 58 out of 266, have been elected by the autonomous parliaments. In addition to the necessary constitutional reform, the fiscal pact will be inescapable, or at least a substantial modification of the financial regime of the current autonomous communities. And it will surely have to change the way in which we have articulated the administration of justice. And just to finish, I would say just to talk about the right to decide. One of the misunderstandings that exist about the federal system is that in it, the parties enjoy the right of self-determination that would allow one of the federated territories to leave the union when they so decide, which is something only typical of the confederations. And yeah, I don't know how I have been talking for almost 10 minutes. I could continue talking about the tensions within the system. Yeah. If you want, I can talk a little bit about the tensions with the system, or I can talk about Catalonia. No? And,
yeah, it would be absolutely wonderful if you could maybe tell us some of the tensions that you experience within the system, and possibly Catalonia as well, if you've got time.
Okay.
You've got another 5 minutes.
Yeah. So peripheral nationalism continues to play a key role in Spanish politics. And some nationalists view that there is a vanishing practical distinction between the terms nationalities and regions, as more competence are transferred to all communities in roughly the same degree, and as other communities have chosen to identify themselves as nationalities. In fact, it has been argued that the establishment of the state of autonomies has led to the creation of the new regional identities and invented communities. So many in Galicia, the Basque Country, Catalonia view their communities as nations, not just nationalities. And Spain as a plurinational state, or a nation of nations, and they have made demands for further devolution or succession. For example, in the year 2004, Basque Parliament approved a plan whereby the Basque Country would approve a new statute of autonomy containing key provisions such as shared sovereignty with Spain, full independence of the judiciary, and the right to self-determination, and assuming all competences except that of the Spanish nationality law, defense, and monetary policy. The plan was rejected by the Spanish Parliament in 2005, and the situation has remained largely stable in that front so far. And a particularly contentious point, especially in Catalonia, has been the one of fiscal tensions, with Catalan nationalists intensifying their demand for further financing during the year 2000, from 2010 to 2020. In this regard, the new rules for fiscal decentralization in force since 2011 already make Spain one of the most decentralized countries in the world, also in budgetary and fiscal matters, with the base for income tax split at 50-50 between the Spanish government and the regions, something unheard of in much bigger federal states such as Germany or the United States, which retain the income tax as an exclusive or primarily federal one. And besides, each region can also decide to set its own income tax band and its own additional rates, higher or lower than the federal rates, with the corresponding income accruing to the region, which no longer has to share it with other regions. This current level of fiscal decentralization has been regarded by a troublesome since challenges the very idea of sovereignty within the country, and comes down to playing the regions against each other, which is particularly problematic when the issue is one of income tax, as this is supposed to enable the reduction of inequalities between the richest and the poorest over and above regional or professional identities. So, in my opinion, the federal solution continues to be a valid option, but we have to really think what is needed for Spain and what kind of federalism we wanted for Spain, taking into account all the problems that exist right now.
Thank you very, very much for that indeed. Just one quick question before we go on. Brendan mentioned how Scotland now is in a position where federalism is unlikely to bring them back into the Union. Do you also think that perhaps in the case of Catalonia, where there's been such division within the people, that it's now too late to save the Kingdom of Spain, and it is in fact maybe too late to impose federalism upon the regions to try and bring them into the keep them within the country?
No, it's not too late. It's not too late. I mean, well, if Catalonia, what they want is to be part of the European Union, the first thing they need to do is not to separate from Spain. Otherwise, I think they will have problems entering the European Union, or at least they wouldn't enter in the short term, no. And but yeah, I think that federalism could be, but it must be. We really need to think what kind of federalism we want. But yeah, it could be the solution for all these independence claims from Catalonia, from Basque countries, from Galicia. That's what many philosophers, many politicians think. But a lot of things needs to be done right now in Spain, and the thing is that we don't have a really federal culture until now in Spain. So yeah.
Thank you very, very much for that indeed. Absolutely. So I'd like to move quickly on to Kodrin Timu, who is going to talk to us a little bit about federalism in Germany. Germany, of course, being the classic federal state in Europe and often used as an example already today. So Kodrin, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation for Volt UK. I find this event to be really, really interesting, and of course, I found especially interesting also the contributions of Brendan Donnelly and Cesar Vera. Of course, when we talk about German experience with federalism, one could write several books on that. Yeah, so in Germany, it begins really early, this kind of political organizations. However, for today, I would like to concentrate on several aspects. I will talk firstly about some basics of the German federalism. Then I will go a little in the constitutional history of Germany, because the German federalism is really, really strong connected to the history of Germany. After that, I will talk about the components of the German federalism and about its strengths and weaknesses. And I will finish with some recent reforms and of course with a very special article in the German Constitution regarding what happens to the federalism when Europe would be united. Yeah, so if one is asking a German lawyer about federalism, every German lawyer would point you to the Constitution of Germany, which in fact 2/3 of it are only federal stuff. So the German Constitution begins with regulating the fundamental rights, and after this, 2/3 of the constitutions are only regulating stuff between the federation and the federative states. The principal article in this regard is Article 20. And in Article 20, we have a really small sentence that says that the Federal Republic of Germany is a democratic and social federate state. So beginning from this sentence, we differentiate in German law between federalism and the federate state. The federative state is actually a specific manifestation of federalism. So when we talk about German federalism is actually, I could say, wrong, because German federalism only exists as an idea. It's not actually concentrated on what actually Germany is. And what one could ask, of course, the question, what is this federative state? This is actually when several states bound themselves together into an entire state and cede some state power to the entire state. And I find it quite importantly not to mix this federative state with the confederation. The confederation doesn't have like a central government. The federation has more power related to this. However, also we had in the history of Germany several steps where Germany was also formed as a confederation. Yeah. The point to begin in the history is, of course, with Charles the Great. We have the Holy Roman Empire, and we have some kind of state formation in the Middle Ages. And in the 15th and 16th century, we have really important reforms in the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire starts to have its own so-called in German Reichskammergericht. That is like a court where the individual state would resolve their disputes through courtly processes and not through war. And we have, during Maximilian I, the emperor, we have also reforms such as Gemeine Pfennig, which is actually like an imperial tax on all of the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah. Moving quickly after the Holy Roman Empire to the early 19th century, one of the most important steps in forming the German federative state came after Napoleon was defeated. So after Napoleon was defeated, the people and the states of Europe wanted, of course, also to solve the problem, what are we building in Germany? And so the German Confederation was created. However, in the same time, yeah, I'm talking about the beginning of 19th century, 1822. In the same time, and here is really interesting, students and liberal professors from the southern German universities, such as Freiburg or Heidelberg, they were traveling between France and Germany. Yeah, and they went, when they came from France, they brought, of course, the liberal ideas, of course, the liberté, égalité, fraternité, but they also brought the idea of a centralized state. So they actually started activating inside the students' associations, which were actually created to learn. They moved more and more in order to make, of course, a revolution in Germany and to create a German unitary state like in France. Of course, that's why the students in this era were actually like called by various governments and states. They were called like terrorists, because they actually were really violent in imposing their their liberalism ideals against the German absolutism. And after that came, after this period came, of course, the first constitutions in Germany. We have the Constitution of St. Paul's Church in 1848, which is a really good constitution because it has original ideas of individual liberties. So actually, somewhere in the process, the whole inspiration from France was lost. So the Germans began to create their own original ideas of liberties. And of course, afterwards in 1871, with the unification of Germany, it came the Bismarck's Imperial Constitution. Now, the Bismarck's Imperial Constitution was one of the first constitutions that regulated Germany as a federation. However, it could also be like seen as a step backwards from Germany because it didn't include any fundamental rights. So the German constitution of the German Empire in the 19th century, they had a lot of articles. It had a lot of articles about the federation, but they let the member states to regulate the fundamental rights of the people. So there were really huge differences in Germany before the First World War between the fundamental rights, for example, in Prussia in the north, and the fundamental rights of Baden, for example, or for Bavaria. No? And after the First World War, we had the Weimar Constitution. It was really unbelievably modern and also contained a catalog of human rights available for all the German states. However, as all of us know, because of the enabling acts of the Nazis, the law to remedy the distress of people in the Reich, Adolf Hitler installed a dictatorship in Germany and further on abolished the German federalism. So in order to also to connect the principle of National Socialism with the organization of Germany, Hitler abolished all the federation and created actually a centralized state. After the Second World War, the Germans created the fundamental law with the help of the Allies, of course, because the Germans did not want to create a constitution as long as two German republics existed. And our actual constitution is actually a result of the German constitutional theory. So the whole constitution based itself on the previous experiences of Germany regarding confederations, the Holy Roman Empire, the Nazi experience, and so on and so forth. That is why nowadays the components of the German federative state are really developed, we could say, in a national matter. So they developed according not only to theory, but also to the German experience. The most important that I would like to address is the organization in federation and states in Germany. This is really important because the states, they have, we call in Germany a state quality. So technically, the political power of the states of Germany does not come from the federative state. They have all original political power. So technically in Germany, we have 17 original political powers. We have one original political powers for the federation, and each and every state have their own original power drawn from the elections of the people. So this determines not only to see a lot of organisms in all these 17 states, but also to further imagine what these ramifications of this thing is. So basically we have in Germany 17 constitutions, 17 governments, 17 heads of governments, 17 parliaments, 17 constitutional courts, and when we are speaking about Germany on an international point of view, we are speaking of Germany as a two-part state. Yeah, so we speak of the federative level and we speak of the state level, which are actually on the same level. So it is not, for example, as Cesar Vera said before, we don't have political power of the states coming from the central government. No, each one of the state has its own original political power and its own state quality, so to say. And of course, by organizing the state into federation and federate states, of course, one of the biggest matters in Germany is the division of responsibilities. Yeah, in order to preserve this state quality, we need substantial responsibilities to preserve this kind of state quality. So we cannot say that the states are states, like Bavaria is a state, but not give Bavaria some matters that are really substantial regarding the state quality. Yeah, so we not say, for example, we are going to regulate everything in Berlin, and then Bavaria will, I don't know, let's say, only do like taxes, also like this. No, each state has to have its own substantial responsibilities that make them as a state. Yeah. And for example, now, for example, the responsibilities are divided between the states and the federation. The federation takes charge, for example, of social security, of defense, and of science matters, while the federative states take charge of education, of police matters, and of culture. Of course, this also division of responsibilities comes with participation of the states at the federal decision-making process. So we have a very unique organism inside a federation called the Bundesrat. The Bundesrat is a representation of the interests of the Länder. It's not a second chamber of the parliament, but it contributes massively to the law-making process in Germany. And of course, we have several other rules, such as the priority of federal law over state law. So if two laws contradict, the federal law always wins. One of the very important component of the German federative state is the allegiance to the federation and from the states. So basically, through the constitution, there is no space for enemies against this federative state. Basically, also the federation can obligate a state if the state does not fulfill its obligation or its matters. The federation can obligate them in doing so, regarding, for example, or maybe, for example, at the Federal Constitutional Court. So that's also like really interesting, because again, like how Cesar Vera presented like the topic about Catalonia, it's not like in Spain that one land can actually like move away or so, because in regard they have state quality, they have original power, but under this system and in which they receive political power from the people, there is absolutely no space regarding the, for example, a movement of succession also. Again, really connected to the allegiance is the cooperative federal state. So we don't simply have some states in Germany that are only near one another. They have to actively work together, and they are actually doing this a lot through, for example, minister conferences, or for example, state contracts between the lands, or deals. They are actively also like collaborating with one another outside, for example, of the specific dispositions in the German constitutions. And we also have some other specific federal conditions, which I could demonstrate through one or two examples. For example, regarding the economic power. We have states in Germany that are economically more developed than other states, yeah, And through our constitutions, the rich German states, they are obliged to pay more to the federation, and also the federation is then redistributing the money between the poorer German states. So basically, we also have this kind of system that life quality everywhere in Germany should come to an equal point, and don't have like completely different life standards. Talking now about the strengths and weaknesses about the German federations, I actually thought about several stuff. Among the strengths, I see that it shrinks actually the concentration of power. So we don't only have in Germany an horizontal separation of power, you know, like executive, legislative, and judicative, but we also have a vertical division of power. I think also that the German Federation makes political participation more possible, 17 parliaments. It secures a larger approach to citizens, and it's better at making reforms, because if one German state tries something, then all the other German states learn. And of course, it's generally seen as an empowerment of democracy, because the citizens are really more near to the decision-making process. When I'm talking about the weaknesses, of course, this whole stuff costs a lot of money. Yeah, so we are talking like 16 plus 1 parliaments to maintain, and not only parliaments, but also governments and agencies and stuff costs a lot of money. So yeah, the German federative state is an expensive state regarding the state organization matter. And of course, it can be very complex regarding decision-making process and confusing, yeah, because also like the people, the politicians that are acting inside the German federal state, they could have like a really hard time seeing if they should or could do something or not. And sometimes, because of the division of the responsibility, we have different living conditions. Because, for example, as I mentioned, the education is a state matter. Yeah. So, for example, we have different schooling systems in Berlin and in Bavaria. Yeah. So this could be a little confusing regarding the life standards. Lastly, the recent reforms were in 2006 and in 2007. They are 2009. They are not so big reforms, so they didn't modify a lot. Basically, the one from 2006, it only made like a clearer division of the competences between the federation and states, such, for example, the defense against terrorism, the protection of nature, university law. They only like specified exactly some responsibilities. And the second reform in 2009, it was a reform of financial aspects. So after the first reform was made, of course, one needed also to organize the financial aspects between the federation and the federate states. Coming to a conclusion, I would like to talk about a very special article in the German Constitution that is called the German Federation in United Europe. So basically, the German Constitution says that with view to establishing a united Europe, the Federal Republic of Germany shall participate in the development of the European Union. Yeah, that's the first sentence of the Article 23 of the German Constitution. However, the further paragraphs of this article are stipulating exactly what should be done with the German federal state. So it says that basically we cannot go into a united Europe without the state quality of the Bundesländer, of the states, of the German states. So Germany's vision in the constitution regarding united Europe means that not only Germany, the federation, and the 16 states would preserve their state qualities, but also they are to be also integrated in a further higher European organisms. So I think it's really interesting that the debate in Germany and the yeah, let's say the views about the German Federation were really debated and were really yeah, also pronounce themselves about the what would happen when Europe would unite. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that indeed. I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists this evening. We'll now open the floor up for questions. If you could please type your questions into the respective chats, whichever platform you're watching it on, and we'll read them out. One thing before we, while you write your questions, I'd like to pick up on one point that you said, Kodran, about the origin of power. In the UK, we've got a strange system where the power is originated from the Queen, of course, and this strange concept of parliamentary sovereignty, which is just as vague as it sounds. Do you think that looking at the German federal system, that a constitution, a codified, strong constitution is absolutely vital for the functioning of the state? And after you've maybe made a comment, I'll ask Brendan to comment on the aspects of codifying the British Constitution, perhaps.
Thank you. I don't think a constitution is really needed to make such a thing. I mean, of course, the UK and Germany, they have really almost completely different legal systems. So while we base almost all the stuff on this constitution and through like a Romanic continental point of view regarding interpreting law and also regarding the obligation also, I don't think the UK could do like the same thing without yeah, basically ignoring their whole legal system developed in the last centuries. However, I found that really interesting regarding the Queen. As I know, I please correct me if I'm wrong. The Queen is like she holds basically the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. What I mean, for example, through political power is, I mean more the origination of the state power through the elections. So maybe if you could play or you could combine maybe a part of the UK legal system with the legitimacy of the organisms through the elections in the UK, maybe one, of course, could reach another definition of political power. But of course, that is again subject to the different legal systems and how the two states are viewing their source of state power.
Thank you. Yes, very interesting. And Brendan, perhaps you'd like to comment a little bit on the requirements of the Constitution of Britain and federalism.
I agree that it's extremely difficult to introduce in a systematic way federalism into British constitutional practice. The famous diarist, the former minister Richard Crossman, once said that the British Constitution says whatever the person with the loudest voice and the nicest suit says it means. And I can understand that if you are trying to institute a constitution which is beyond amendment from day to day, then that's something very different from the constitution we have at the moment. But I'm afraid that I think that the present situation suggests very strongly that we do need to move towards a much more codified constitution, because what has kept the United Kingdom balanced and reasonably well functioning has been the willingness of the political class to abide by certain conventions of truth and decency and responsibility. And those conventions are now being ignored and have been for the past 2 or 3 years. What has happened is that Brexit has injected into the United Kingdom system a poison, a destructive poison, which may well lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom, which only will be resisted, it seems to me, by an anti-conservative coalition of some kind or another. Now, when that comes about, it will then be able, and we'll see the necessity of a much more codified constitution. If we had a codified constitution, then in a rather short period of time, it will come to be accepted as a constitutional convention. I think there is a possibility of self-reform within the British constitutional system, but I don't underestimate the difficulties of its coming about. But I think that if there were a political commitment by the Labour Party, by the Liberal Democrats, by all the parties apart from the Conservative Party, the thing is possible. And I think it's certainly very necessary.
Thank you very much for that. So we'll move into the first question. We've got a question here from Adam Winstanley up in Scotland. And he asks, how can we persuade these wealthy, strong states to change their ways and alter the status quo that obviously benefits them, to adopt more decentralized models of government? And anyone can pick that up. Besser, are you still there?
Yes, shall I answer that?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think in the case of Scotland, there is enormous political pressure for a referendum, and I think there probably will be one held. I don't necessarily think that it will lead to Scottish independence. I think it might, but I don't think that it's impossible that the Scottish electorate would decide to remain within the Union. I think that if they do decide to remain within the Union, then the way of cementing and fastening the Union will be to have a much more federal Britain. My hesitations about the federal Britain are whether it can be set up in time to prevent now Scottish independence, if that's what the majority of Scots decide they want in the coming referendum.
Absolutely. I think it's a very tight timescale. I think it would be impossible to imagine we'll have federalism in the UK in the next 2 or 3 years, while we've already seen how powerful the Scottish independence referendum has been. And unlike Brexit, where the young were generally against Brexit, and a lot of people therefore say that the rejoin is inevitable, in Scotland we see a massive youth organisation that really do want to push for independence. And with that youth wave behind them, I think it's very, very unlikely that independence will not happen. I think independence is a very real and serious option that the UK will follow.
Can I just say something there? That the opinion polls suggest that opinion is moving definitely against Brexit, and we'll find ourselves in the new year confronting real economic problems, new pressing economic problems, on the basis of a mandate of 4 or 5 years ago, which was based on fantasy and lies. I think the volatility that may well introduce into British politics is something that people underestimate. I don't think it's something which will necessarily be resolved peacefully and in the traditional British way. I think we're going to face political challenges next year that we haven't faced for many decades.
Absolutely, and with that added on with the COVID crisis, absolutely.
Yeah, Alex. I wanted to say for the case of Spain, for any federal pact, symmetrical or asymmetrical partners willing to pact are required, and there are very few federalists in Spain, particularly outside Catalonia. And Podemos, is the extreme left party in Spain, which is governing now with PSOE. Podemos might be a case. The socialists have several times included federalism in their manifestos, but when in power, they have never tried to reform the constitution accordingly. And one might even find secession easier than federalization, as for the first, at least in theory, a unilateral decision might be sufficient, provided this side has the power, which Catalonia, at least now, has not. And while federal solutions, if combined with a constitutional recognition of Spain's plurinational character, might be highly advisable to accommodate minority nations like Catalonia and to combine democracy and constitutionalism, fragmented party systems and minority governments on both sides make the necessary constitutional amendments even more improbable than ever. So it's difficult in Spain.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next question. We've got a question from Thor from Volt Denmark and Volt Europa. And he asks, perhaps this one will be directed to Kodrin. Is it fair to say that federalism does not take away power from nation states and other bodies, but instead creates new powers that didn't exist?
Yes, I think I would answer this question with a yes. Especially because we have a saying in German constitutional law. We have a saying that says, unity in diversity and diversified unity. So that was actually what I was trying to also say when I was referring to the component of the state quality, because the power and the state, the formation of the German states, they don't come from the federation. It's not Berlin who decides that, okay, you can have this much power or this much power, or Bavaria can have this much power or so. So every state is actually creating its own power through local elections, through local governments, through local parliaments, and so on. And together they contribute also in the federation, and the federation, a part of this, has also another source of power. So basically, my answer to the question is yes, we have 17 sources of power in Germany. We don't have only one, but the people are voting a lot and are participating a lot. And that combines ultimately with the aspect that I saw as a strength of German federalism, because democracy is being intensified a lot in regarding this aspect.
Can I say something about that, particularly about European federalism? I certainly think it's true that the European Federation has created and will continue to create powers that weren't there before. But I would stress that the calculation is a different one for big countries compared to small countries. The difference between a country like Germany, France, perhaps the United Kingdom, Spain, and Italy, the difference between their being able to act on their own and the extra power that they have through being in a federation is less than the difference for very small countries. If you look at the example of foreign policy, it is not wholly unreasonable to believe that Germany can run an independent foreign policy. Germany would be better off, in my view, running a coordinated foreign policy, a federal foreign policy with its neighbours. But it is conceivable that it might be able to run a foreign policy of its own. Whereas for Luxembourg, Luxembourg is no criticism of Luxembourg, the possibility of Luxembourg having a completely, effectively independent foreign policy is much less. One of the founding pillars of the European Union, seems to me, was that Germany in particular was willing to continue with the equation which said, we are more interested in the plus, in the extra element that comes from European solidarity. And I'm afraid there was a time over the past 10 years where, as far as the Eurozone was concerned, Germany did not always live up to that traditional approach. I think it asked itself, what do we want to do in order to have an independent Germany within the Eurozone? I'm happy to say that I think that view is softening now. And I think it's a very positive development for the future of Europe. But let me quote the well-known saying that Europe is made up of small countries, but there are some countries that haven't realized that they're small countries. That's true, but it's easier for Luxembourg to realize it's a small country than it is for Germany or Spain or the United Kingdom.
And on that question, perhaps, we've got another question here that raises the issue that in these periods of lacking of solidarity during the coronavirus, of course, there was a huge calls for solidarity within Europe. How are we able to promote solidarity between nations, whether that be on a small local level between the likes of the Cornish and the English, or perhaps that be on the larger level between the Germans and the Luxembourgish? If you've got any ideas, perhaps, on how we can help promote that that level of solidarity between nations to improve cooperation, I would be very interested to hear that. Tessa, perhaps, especially in the case of Spain, we've had a lot of lacking solidarity between Catalonia and the Madrid, the centre, and also in the past with the Basque Country, of course.
Well, I can tell you how the situation has been in Spain during the COVID, and how it has all worked, with the actual system that we have. Well, I think the state of autonomies in Spain has demonstrated that it supports a state of alarm without cracking or losing effectiveness. This has two possible readings. On the one hand, the one supported by the right parties like Partido Popular or Ciudadanos, the autonomous state is a still viable instrument. But also, on the other hand, the one supported by PSOE and Podemos, the left parties, they think that it can continue to advance towards federalism without problems to act as a united nation in its diversity. And as autonomous communities, including Catalonia, they could assume they are the son of the state and more in health, and that has given rise to the fact that they could see the reality of our country structure. And the alarm state has been carried out by everyone, even those who did not agree on the centralization of the responses. And the government of Spain has assumed the responsibility of the decisions of the fight against the pandemic without needing to diminish the competences of management of the autonomous communities. That's what at least happened in Spain. What happens in Europe is different. We have been claiming for France and so on. We have seen that many countries like Germany and Holland, they were rejecting this help sometimes. But I think now is everything quite calm and quite clear. And finally, there had been talks and negotiations, which I think goes in the right way for the European Union. Regarding Spain, Italy, and all these countries, it might need a little more help from the North countries in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Germany, with the federal system, they did really well at dealing with the whole coronavirus crisis as a whole, compared to the unitary states such as the United Kingdom and Spain. So how come that the response to coronavirus was so successful, even though government and powers are distributed amongst regions?
Well, of course, there are several reasons that contributed to that. But regarding the federal aspect, of course, this came up as a shock also in Germany at the beginning of March. However, because of the federal aspects, the states started acting a little differently. So, for example, while Bavaria instaurated a state of emergency, other German states didn't do this, and there were actually several different measures in every German state. And this actually, in my opinion, contributed to understand what could be the best measure to be taken in a united Germany. So basically, one could have looked what happened, for example, in Bavaria at the beginning of March, where Bavaria instaurated the emergency crisis. And one could look, for example, what happened in the north, where the measures were actually practically non-existent at the beginning. Yeah, and in these kind of times, of course, the Chancellor Angela Merkel came and said, okay, we need to meet all the ministers, all the presidents of the German states, and we have to have a unified solution. But I think also what contributed afterwards to a really good unified solutions is also this division of responsibility and the possibility that the German federal states could act and have acted separately at the beginning, so that one could rapidly learn from the experience of one state or the other. Even though, of course, there was also a little bit of conflict involved in during the spring, because several states wanted to do something else, and Angela Merkel was trying to unify all the opinions of all the governments. So, of course, this could be also looked at through this point of view, that the federalism actually created a conflict state. But I think, in my opinion, it proved itself effective, and it proved itself good regarding the
As far as Europe is concerned, even though there isn't yet full agreement, the shifting of the debate over the past 3 months has been extraordinary. The sums of money which are being discussed and the possibilities of solidarity, financial solidarity in one form or another, are much more developed than they were 3 months ago. So I'm quite confident that whatever happens, it will mark an important step towards the federalization, the economic and political federalization of the European Union. It's a terrible price, of course, to have to pay for it, but I think that that's the way historically it's going to work out.
Absolutely, yes. Coronavirus has turned everything upside down, and it's definitely changed a lot of how we think in politics altogether. One question we had sent in to us before this event was regarding Cornish nationalism. Cornwall being a small little bit of land on the very bottom toe of England, which is not necessarily recognised as a separate region by the current system that we have in the UK, although they are now registered as a nationality at least. It is in the past, federalism and the discussion around federalism in the UK has often been around this West Lothian question, which is the question of, okay, Scotland has a parliament, Wales now has a parliament, previously had an assembly, and Northern Ireland has an assembly, but England does not, which means that Scottish MPs in theory can vote on English laws. The big counter argument to this has been to create a large English parliament that would effectively create England on par to Scotland and Wales. This has the unfortunate side effect is you have nations within England that would be unrepresented and would be sort of subsumed into the larger state. In Germany, this is kind of similar. In the case of Bavaria, you have the small region of Franconia to the north, which has been subsumed into Bavaria. I'd like to ask Kodrin, how does Germany deal with the fact that some of these landers have multiple groups within them that would historically identify as separate areas?
Well, as I said before, the majority of the German states were independent before. So we have actually only after the Second World War, the Allies, and within the occupation zones of Germany, it was tried that first of all to get rid of Prussia. So that's why we don't have Prussia nowadays. And second of all, to try and mix some German lands in order to make some, let's say, artificial ones. Yeah. So, for example, Baden-Württemberg didn't exist before. We had before Baden and we had before Württemberg, but the combined state Baden-Württemberg didn't actually exist before. However, several other states did exist, such as Hamburg, for example, no? or Bremen also, or Bavaria. And regarding the situation in Franconia, out of a German point of view, it was always the stuff this kind of stuff with Bavaria. So basically, when Germany united in the 19th century, Bavaria only joined Germany because they wanted to get rid of Austria in the back. So Bavaria was always thinking of themselves as a really good independent state that would really like be powerful on its own. And actually, after the First World War, Bavaria also was one of the German countries that had a constitution before the Weimar Constitution that proclaimed Bayern as a Soviet Socialist Republic. Yeah, so we have a Soviet Socialist Republic of Bavaria for 3 months existing after the First World War, separate from the rest of Germany. After this, of course, the people in Berlin managed to keep together the states, but it was also again of a problem to be dealt with. And after the Second World War, Bavaria was also the only German state that didn't accept the German constitution. It accepted a little later on. So when the German states voted about the actual German constitution, Bavaria refused to do so, and it put in its own constitution that should a German state be created, then Bavaria will join it, more or less, if the Bavarians agree with them. Nowadays, as I said, even though there are several parties, like the Free Bavaria Party, that are really active, by the way, in Franconia, their movement is actually out of the law. So it's basically illegal what they would like to do. First of all, because they contradict the constitution. So we cannot talk about allegiance to the federation or cooperative federalism if someone wants to get out. And second of all, because we have these state protection services, for example, such as the secret services in Germany, they are also gathering information and fighting also to preserve the whole unity of the German people. So basically, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, is also gathering information about movements that, for example, want to destroy one German state or not. So there are also several offices in Germany that can take care of these kind of matters, one sense or another. Of course, the free democratic participation and the other civic liberties are all assured. And of course, the Free Bavarian Party also participates to local elections. Sometimes they win also some mandates. However, there isn't actual from a majority of the Bavarians. There cannot be. I don't think there can be the talk about the separation movement also.
Yeah, that's very, very good. That's very interesting. So we're nearly at the end of our time now, and I'll ask for one final round, and I'll ask you all to speak in the order you originally spoke in. But I'd like you to address in your final statements as is a question from Alex Hyder, the co-president of Volt UK. Does it really take a crisis like war or a pandemic to implement such constitutional changes? And if Brendan, you'd like to start.
It's certainly a great deal easier to implement such constitutional changes in times of crisis, particularly a very negative crisis. And I'll tell you why. Because the people who are going to make the changes, if you don't have a crisis, are the people who are well established in the present system. If, for instance, in the United Kingdom, there were a possibility of proportional representation being considered, then the people who would have to draw up the laws and the constitutional changes to bring that about are the sitting members of Parliament, many of whom would lose their positions if they accepted this new system. It is, sadly, a great advantage if you want radical change, if the previous established class, because of war or pandemic or whatever it is, has either been eliminated or in some ways have had their power undermined. I mentioned that for European federalism, the pandemic is a terrible price to pay, but it's a price we're paying, and I hope we will be able to draw the right conclusions from it. And I'm quite optimistic that we will. I'm much more optimistic about the federal future of the European Union now than I am about the federal future in the short term of the United Kingdom. I see a number of problems for the United Kingdom arising essentially from Brexit, and there are no good answers other than by further crisis to these challenges posed to the United Kingdom. So I'm sorry to have a rather bleak and rather unhappy message, but I take consolation from the fact that I'm very optimistic about the way the European Union is now going, and in due course, the United Kingdom, perhaps in separate elements. Perhaps it will be Scotland and Northern Ireland as part of Ireland, or perhaps even Wales, that will rejoin the European Union. But I'm quite sure that all of us in the United Kingdom, certainly yourself, will live to see Britain back in the in the European Union.
I certainly hope so. No doubt about that, and I think it will happen, but it's a matter of when, very much so, and not if. We are all on the same continent after all. Thank you very much for that, Brendan, or your rather bleak outlook. But I'm sure there's some optimism in there somewhere. Tessa.
Yes. Well, you know, I don't think the pandemic must force us to think about a solution which might not be the ideal solution. No, so we don't need to be forced. In time of crisis, it's better to think, but not to implement changes. Changes must be implemented during calm, tranquil times. No, not when one is rushing. No, or so also for Spain, if we want to change the current model of territorial organization, we need to this need to go through via constitutional amendment. So this needs time. This needs time and needs a lot of reflection through the academic world and politicians and people and referendums. So it's better to make changes with enough time to think about them. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and Katrin, final remarks.
Yeah, well, I fully agree to Brendan Donnelly and Cesar Vera. Of course, that crises like war are making it a lot easier to implement such constitutional changes. And of course, we can have a look at the whole history of Europe and the constitutional history of Europe, that the major constitutional changes came after the crisis. And especially that's why I would like to point out that also like the coronavirus could actually be also for European federalism perspective could be actually a blessing in disguise.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you to all three panelists. A quick word by myself. I mean, thank you very much. And although Brendan has a very bleak outlook for the UK, I think the Brexit crisis itself will be a little coronavirus for Britain. And I think a lot of political changes are on the way. The current Conservative government has never looked weaker, and the opposition has never looked stronger. We're seeing a growth both in the Labour Party, but also a lot of small parties. And interestingly, small regional parties within the UK are also seeing growth. So perhaps federalism is on the rise in the UK. And whether we save Scotland in time or not, there's certainly a lot more discussion to be had. Thank you very much for all attending. Thank you very much for everyone who's asked questions. I apologize to those who we didn't manage to reach. Many of you sent in many questions. But thank you nonetheless. Thank you to the team at Volt United Kingdom who have organized this and put everything together. And also thank you to Volt Europa who have dealt with the tech aspects. So once again,
they say, from your mouth to God's ear. I hope that it will work out that way.
I hope so as well. And let's hope for a speedy return of Britain to the European Union as best as we possibly can. All right. Thank you very much and good evening.
Bye. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Brendan.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Pleasure. Good night.